ko, and welcome to the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. My name is Constance Hale, and I'm joining you from Oakland, California, imagining that I'm in Honolulu with Vicky Durand, Toby Neal, and Susanna Moore, two of whom are in Honolulu as I speak. One is in New York. I thought I would have each of you maybe talk a little bit about your book by telling us why you wrote a memoir. You know, maybe introduce your book by telling us the why. And maybe Toby, we'll start with you because 30 books you've written, novels, all fiction, and then you decide to write a memoir. So can you tell us why you wrote a memoir and what that was like after writing fiction?
Well, I've always said that writing a memoir has been my personal Everest, and it's a very difficult form to do well and to do commercially well. And I feel like all of my other books were working up to it. So quite frankly, and now I'm going to be releasing my second memoir in 2021. It's being shopped to publishers right now, and it's a travel memoir. But Freckled did take me close to 10 years, and it reads fast. It's a fast, easy read, but it actually was quite challenging to write. And I think anybody who's done a memoir will agree that it's one of the most taxing ways. And then to write something that's easy to read is also another challenge.
Vicky, yours is a memoir and a biography. And I don't know if you set out to write a memoir, but maybe you could talk about the way that your memoir came about.
Well, my mother, who was like you said, was a Renaissance woman who believed in trying anything exciting at least once, led an amazing and a very inspiring life because she was so accomplished and she did so many things. And she started surfing at 41 and was a jeweler, an artist, a builder. She built houses. She was a fisherwoman and a haiku writer and a potter. And she led such an inspirational life that I decided that her story needed to be told and to be shared with the world. So that was my motivation for writing the book. And at first I thought I was writing a memoir, but then I realized, no, it's a biography, but it involves so much of it. She was the perfect mother. So we had a wonderful life together surfing during my teenage years. And so it involves me also. So it's more of a biography, but also has a memoir part to it.
So in the case of Toby and Vicky, Toby, you were describing quite a long period, really from your birth until you went to college, essentially. Vicky, in your case, you were describing the entirety of your mother's life, 98 years. So there was quite a broad swath. Susanna, your memoir is interesting in that actually it focuses on a shorter segment of your life, and yet you build in other aspects of your life. So how did you settle on that, that particular chunk of your life, and how did you decide to write a memoir after being essentially a fiction writer and a very accomplished one at that?
I was having trouble thinking of what I would write next as a novel. I had no idea. It's not a thought in my head. And friends had been encouraging me for years to write about the 10-year period from the time I was like 22 until I was 32 that I lived in Los Angeles. And so I began to write that. I was a little dubious. I wasn't sure how it would go. I wasn't sure I could do it. And I was very intent on not writing about my childhood. I felt I had written about it quite a bit, especially in the first 3 novels, which are very autobiographical. I didn't want to write any more about it. And also it's painful to write about my childhood. But I discovered that I couldn't write about those 10 years without some explanation of what had come before, in part because my choices and my decisions were often so self-destructive or so naive that without an explanation of what had come before, I would have seemed very lost.
This is a nice segue into kind of the different ways that each of you wrote your memoirs. Toby, I was so interested in your book, where it's mostly stories. It's chronological, and you're telling the story pretty much from, I think it starts when you're about 2 years old, and you tell incidents as they happen. And yet I couldn't help noticing and loving your descriptions of nature. And so throughout the book, there you convey the lushness of Hawaii, and there's such a strong sense of place. So Susanna says, sometimes you're not aware of exactly why you're writing something until later. How did those work for you, and how did it work for you to go between the story of your family, which was so complicated and weird, if I might say so,
Yes.
descriptions of Wainiha Valley and the ocean. So how did you find the right balance?
I was attempting, and I hope that readers will pick up on this. A few reviewers have picked up on this, that the voice of the story is the voice of me at that chronological age. So it begins when I'm 4 on Pipeline, and we lived on the very North Shore, and I'm very simplistic. My descriptions are very simplistic but vivid. And I worked very hard to be in the mind of my memory as a child, and how those simple words capture the picture of what's happening. And then I aged up the writing all the way till I was 18 and much more sophisticated. One thing that, and I will circle back to the nature description balance, but one thing that I absolutely had to do was find some explanation for the times, because the times on Kauai in 1970 were very bad for haoles. And when I was writing it, from the choice in construction wise of being in first person present tense in a child's point of view, I couldn't explain what was happening economically then, or racially then, or why there was so much tension and difficulty. And so I asked John Wareheim, who's famous for the Taylor Camp book and movie, I had read a really good essay by him in the Surfer's Journal, and I asked him to provide the foreword for the book, so he could place the times in a way that would explain why these different bizarre things were happening, because I couldn't do that in my chosen point of view. So that is one of the reasons why the book took me so long to write, because I tried all these other ways to write it. First of all, as a fiction novel, because I was comfortable with that, and I was one removed from the material, and I wasn't going to get in trouble or ruffle any feathers. And then another way as a therapist, because I'm a therapist, and I wrote it sort of as if I was a client, and I tried all these things. And when I finally stopped and asked myself, what did I want my reader to experience? That's when I knew how I needed to write the book. And I wanted to provide a certain kind of experience for readers that is literally taking them by the hand and leading them, ushering them into my life, into this very sensory, brilliant, textural world that is simply explained, and things are just happening. And then you eventually begin to make sense of it. One of the metaphors that emerged in my writing of the book was the tsunami. Mm-hmm. And when I was growing up in Hanalei, we were constantly being drilled on tsunami alerts, and hiding under your desk and having your tsunami bag packed, And I became very obsessed at about 10 or 11 with this coming tsunami. Turns out that was the end of the crescendo or a high point of our family's crisis in alcohol and drug abuse. And I was experiencing it as an external metaphor. So that was really interesting to arrive at in the process of writing.
So I'm going to cut you off just to
Yeah.
keep things rolling. Vicky, I know because full disclosure, I worked with you on the book as an editor. So I know that the scenes became more important as the writing and the revising went on. So can you talk a little bit about how you wrote your scenes and what the scenes, of course, there were scenes of you and your mother surfing. Those were certainly important, but talk a little bit about how you saw the scenes fitting into the story.
Well, when I first started, I wanted to tell the story of my mother and her life and our life together. And I wrote it somewhat chronologically and somewhat mixed. And then when I came upon you, I thought I was going to tell a lot of the story with pictures. And I'll never forget when I sent you the first draft, and I was very weak on my scene writing because I'm new to the story writing. And the first thing you said was, take all those pictures out right now. And I'd spent days putting them in. And we are going to write scenes. And so slowly, I owe it to you for teaching me how to, first of all, I sat down and identified what the important scenes were. And then I started writing them. And with your help, I was able to slowly, very slowly and painfully make them better and more realistic. And
so, that leads me to a question that I'm fascinated to ask all of you, which is, you were writing, all of you, about times pretty far in the past.
Yeah.
And in the case of Toby, and in all of your cases, Toby, you're writing about yourself as a kid, sometimes 4 years old, 7 years old. Susanna, you're writing about a time before you were really a writer intentionally. I mean, you were writing and you had a writer, you were surrounded by a lot of writers, but you weren't writing at the time or taking notes. Vicky, you never imagined when you were going through those experiences that you would one day write about them. So how did you, Susanna, I'll start with you because I was so struck in some of your scenes. You go out fishing with your husband and you remember the names of the fish that you caught. And there's a beauty, talk about scenes. There's a wonderful, one of my favorite scenes was about catching mahi-mahi, which you said you actually disliked catching mahi-mahi. And then you described your garden and all the plants in your garden. So my question to all of you is, what was the process of writing those scenes when they had happened so far in the past and you hadn't necessarily been taking notes at the time? Susanna, what did you do do you just have an incredible memory, or how did it work?
I think writers do have, in general, good memories because they're paying attention. They're looking, they're observing, there's often that split in self that I write about when we were taken to the zoo after my mother died, in which I was first aware that I was in the moment, but I was also watching myself in the moment, which I think is a very writerly habit. No, I did not keep a journal. I did keep what is called a commonplace book, in which I wrote down mostly things from other books that caught my attention, sometimes conversations, sometimes just a sentence. But as I was worried that I had certain things wrong, and also because I didn't want to offend or distress anybody, I did send it to people like Peter Davis and my brothers and sisters and asked them First of all, if I had made any errors, but also if there was anything in the book that they would prefer not be there. And of course I would take whatever upset them out. And no one had to take anything out. Peter corrected a couple of mistakes that I had made, but also unlike you, Vicky and Toby, I was writing about something 50 years ago, and so a lot of the people I realized again while I was writing were dead. So in a way, I probably got away with more than I should have.
So that's a great, I mean, I'd like to actually use that as a segue to another question, or if you want to talk about how you remembered things, but embedded in Susanna's answer is how you work with other people who are in your story. So the other people in your story, in a way, are sources for you. They'll have memories, they may have records. Vicky, in your case, you found a box that your mother had left, and so you had primary source material, and you had your mother's words in the box. But then the flip side of that, or the double-edged sword, is that if you seek out their memories or seek them out as sources, then it can get dicey when they read what you've written. And I know everyone who tackles this genre of memoir has to tackle this question of what am I going to include and what am I going to withhold, and how do I, is it okay to betray a trust? Is it okay to reveal secrets? So maybe, Toby, take whatever part of that complex question you want. And I don't want to, you know, I want to make sure we get to questions from the audience in about 10 minutes. So as quickly as you can answer such a complicated question.
Well, I feel very blessed that both of my parents knew I was going to do this book, and they helped me. And they are in the position of being on the other side of sobriety. And the story is a lot about their, their drug and alcohol use, and then our journey into recovery. And they've both been clean and sober ever since. They got sober in my teens. So in their, on their behalf, they both, my mom helped me with the timeline of the amount of moves, because that was just insane how many times we moved in different places and all over the island. And she had made a timeline and helped me. I too gave my parents an early draft. My dad got offended after about 100 pages and said, this is your story, do what you need to do. And my mom also was like, well, I guess it's going to be all out there. And so in that way, it continues to unfold as we work through things. But it's been a healing experience.
Interesting. Vicky, did you have a lot of characters?
Yeah, well, mine, when we surfed in the mid-50s, there were only 2,000 people surfing on Oahu. And my mother was very insightful. And she said, Vicky, this sport is going to be really big and you need to keep notes because someday you might want to write about it. And I went, oh, no, mother, I'm too busy living the sport. You need to keep the notes. So neither one of us kept any notes. So a year and a half into writing, I discovered this cardboard box with her autobiography written to cover ages 4 to 24 with a lot of information. There was memorabilia, there were pictures, there were letters, which gave me a lot of clues because I had not asked a lot of important questions about how she felt about all of the events that happened in her life. And so I had to do a lot of detective work and memory. And then the pictures brought up the memory. And then I went to everybody that was still alive that knew her and got them to write a reflection about her. And and it just, you know, it just going way back.
I remember that you, I mean, long after you had done a first draft, you ended up in doing what I call backfilling. I mean, you went back and you did research. And so there's often a back and forth between the draft and then the filling in the factual material. Susanna, I'd like to talk before we open it up for questions, and just to remind everybody that you can pose a question in the chat area, and then I will read it for the panelists. I'd like to just talk briefly, Susanna, about voice and the remarkable voice of Miss voice, your narrative voice, because I think Toby and Vicky, both of you are telling your stories in a pretty accessible, straightforward way. I think you're doing an amazing job of just being honest about the experiences and telling your story. Susanna, something else is at play in your book. This notion of knowing yourself and not knowing yourself, and the kind of detachment that you describe as a girl of, I believe, 11 when you were at the zoo, and you were going through the experience and you were looking at the experience. And there's a very unusual voice, I think, in your book. And I wonder how much of that is just you and how much you played with it as you were writing it, and how you think of the voice of your book and the why of the voice.
I think the voice is me. I think that it would be impossible to write it in any other way. It would be affected and maybe superficial. I was clear when I was writing it about certain things. One, I didn't want it to be a story of, my triumph over adversity. I didn't want it to be a book about how I became a writer in any specific terms, because I was hoping that would be evident in just the story itself. And of course, in the book, the memoir, I never even mentioned that I've become a writer, or the books that I've written, which was deliberate. I also, I didn't want to make judgments. And I think that not making judgments, trying to be objective, gives it a certain coolness and a certain pulling away, which I think probably is like me. But and although I did judge people, I mean, people like Ole Cassini in the book are my first husband. I think I make it clear what I felt and feel now.
Mm-hmm.
I was intent on not making it a diatribe or accusatory or even unkind. I wanted it to be very objective, not subjective, which of course is probably impossible, but I tried.
Well, it's also, I think, in some ways, the structure was interesting too, because whereas, for example, Toby, we saw the accumulation of experiences and we sort of went with you on a path of experience. And Vicky, in terms of your mother's life, we saw her over and over again confronting challenges and besting them and changing her life when it wasn't to her satisfaction. And it proceeds more or less chronologically. You do go back to a scene at the very beginning of the book, and you go backwards in time at the end of the book. But Susanna, it seems to me that part of the structure too, that there's a sort of time release to the story in your book. So we get bits of your childhood interspersed throughout the book, and the really painful, difficult material is at the end, and it almost comes as a surprise. So I think was the structure, did you think about that structure in the same way that you did voice, to sort of keep a damper on the material?
I also hope that there are parts of the book that are funny and are amusing. And on the first draft that I wrote, it was chronological. started when I was a child, went through so that my mother's death and my father's remarriage, my stepmother, all of that came in order. And then I realized on reading it that I couldn't go from that to something amusing and funny. It just was jarring and it didn't work. I couldn't go from my mother's death to, my stories that I hope are funny about working at Bergdorf's. It just was, it was problematic and even a bit unpleasant. So I realized that I had to save the hard parts, so to speak, until I had established the tone and in a way the plot of the memoir.
Yeah, I can see that, how that worked. So I'm going to go to questions, and I'm going to give director's prerogative to Roger Jelinek, the wonderful impresario of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. It would not exist without Roger's vision, and it would not exist without Roger's enthusiasm and his understanding and sympathy for writers and musicians. So with all of those, we are indebted to you, Roger. I will ask your question first of the panelists, which is, in retrospect, what would you change, add, or rewrite in your book? And maybe we'll start with Vicky.
Yes, I would definitely change a few things. I would add more detail, more personal details, possibly.
Never enough.
Indexing.
Never enough detail, it's true.
I'm hoping for a redo.
Toby, you were nodding your head that you might change some things?
Yeah, I basically named a lot of people, and Kauai is a very small place. And in hindsight, I have had some blowback, not a lot, but some. And I only changed the names of people who became famous or who were otherwise, going to be impacted by being named. What I didn't expect is that the book would be so big. I've sold a lot of books. I mean, it's been my biggest single seller. And it's been a bit of a shock to me. And now I would say my answer is, I'm sorry, I'm getting to it, is that I would change much more names. I would change everybody's name.